then PDS Limited. That's the corporate on our radar this afternoon. And we now have the group CEO of the company, Mr. Sanjay Jain, who is now joining us. Mr. Jain, afternoon. Thank you so much for taking your time out and joining us here on ET Now, and several developments that have taken place within the textile sector. After a lot of uncertainty and a lot of volatility when it comes to regulations, government has now extended the benefits of RoDTEP for the sector. Can you tell us how will this benefit the entire sector, and what kind of benefits do you expect from this regulatory changes that perhaps will be in your benefit?
As we all know that the apparel and textile sector is trying to do a balancing act among three pressures. On one hand, there is this geopolitical cost shocks that are coming in. There is cautious demand in the main US, UK, EU market. Then there is third, this dependence on the policy framework. So I think to answer your question with the backdrop, the rebate continuation that the government of India has allowed till September 2026 will give the industry, kind of a cushion in terms of approximately 6% on the FOB value as a fuel, as a kind of saving to combat the pressures on input costs that are coming in because of the Middle Eastern crisis. So I think it's in the near term, it is going to be increasing our ability to absorb these cost shocks while the overall demand has been subdued for some time now.
Right, so textile sector has been facing a lot of impact earlier because of tariffs, and now because of geopolitical tensions, and exports, I believe, have been impacted. So this has come in as a big respite for the sector. But do you expect the scheme to be extended further as well? For now, it has been extended by only 6 months. What after that? Do you think the government will extend support even after the current 6-month tenure ends?
In fact, you raised a very important point. That would be my humble submission to the government, that there has been extensions being done from time to time, and right now it is for 6 months. And we all know that the apparel sector has a significant dependence on the policy framework. I mean, some of our neighboring countries like Bangladesh, and other Sri Lanka and other countries are already beneficiary of low cost structures. While on one hand, we have taken structural measures to enable the industry become cost competitive, but these are going to span out over the next 2 years, 3 years and on unfolding. So therefore, in the near term, such rebates are extremely important. But if you only do it for six months, it prevents us from a medium to long term planning. So my submission would be that kindly consider announcing this for a 3 to 5 year horizon, so that we know we are getting this cost benefit. And as a result, we will get the courage to go ahead and talk to our retail customers and lock them in for a relatively longer term contracts as compared to having a slight cost disadvantage at present.
Mr. Jain, also wanted your thoughts on the exposure to the Middle East region. How much of your total exports comes from Middle East, and are you already seeing any kind of impact on account of West Asia conflict on your operations and your export sales?
See, if I talk about firstly for the entire industry, from our apparel textile exports about a year back, which were running at a 38 billion run rate, the exports to Middle East were less than 5%, and specific to UAE, they were less than 4% or so. So I think the overall, this has not been one of the biggest markets in terms of exports out of India. And similarly for PDS as well, UK, Europe, and then US have been more than 85% of our market. So in our case as well, a small percentage of 3-4% come from Middle East, market. So therefore, to that extent, yes, whatever is happening, has a bearing on our that small percentage of the overall top line.
Okay, so that's as far as the impact of West Asia conflict on your exports is concerned, but also wanted your thoughts, Mr. Jain, on raw material supply chain. And is that a problem for you because of West Asia conflict? Has there been any impact on raw material availability?
Yeah, absolutely. There has been, I think, in terms of raw material, the synthetic fibers, the man-made fibers, which have a dependency on crude, therefore getting adversely impacted because of the crude prices. So that is on the immediate raw material front. And of course, the logistics and freight costs, are significantly getting impacted. On one hand, there is this container availability alignment issues, and on the other hand, the rising costs. So that's where I think somewhere our government has been sensitive to these cost pressure that the industry is facing, and that's why the rebate got extended till September 26th. So to answer your point, yes, there has been pressure that are coming our way for industry on the whole.
Right. So, Mr. Jain, clearly we are seeing an impact on India's textile industry on account of everything that is happening globally. But what about domestic demand then? Is it holding up despite the geopolitical turmoil?
See, if I talk about international market, there are three large separate markets. For example, US, the demand has been relatively resilient in the near term. If you look at the February retail sales data, it is 0.6% up, which is a good rate for a US market. And in fact, this is the overall retail sales. The apparel sector has also benefited. But I think the customer is increasingly becoming price sensitive. So therefore, customer is looking at in the lower segment, low to mid segment, there is more traction. But while this has been the recent phenomena in terms of good resilience, but whatever is happening in the world for what we just discussed in terms of the cost pressures, supply chains getting impacted, I think 2 quarters down the line, one may actually see that things are getting impacted because of the current situation. Talking about the other large market, EU, I think that market has been broadly stable. The growth rates have been much slower, but this again is a market that has become actually value driven. Given whatever has happened last 2 years in terms of inflation, the Ukraine war, and the high interest rate that have prevailed for a larger period of time, the demands have been pretty much stable. But UK is another market wherein I think amongst the three, relatively weaker market because of the cost of living pressures. So there, I think the customer is really looking at discounted sales, really looking at a price as a buying decision point, and hence as a retailer in general, and for PDS specific, for example, our opportunity would be more as to how I can value offer to the retailer to try and bring the cost structures down, through our offering like sourcing as a service, or managing their brands. So I think these are the three markets in terms of different characteristics. But on the whole, whatever is happening in the Middle East, is going to have an impact on all markets.
Clearly, so we are seeing impact across markets, but let's also talk about FTAs that India has signed in recent times. India signed an FTA with EU, with UK, and several others are also in the fray, something like India-US trade deal. What kind of benefit are you already seeing as a result of these FTAs that India has signed? And what kind of benefit will fructify as and when there is certainty on tariffs on US?
I think allow me to address this question more for the sector on the whole. I think UK and Europe are currently 55-60%, plus US are 55-60% of the overall, exports composition. So to that extent, for the key markets, wherever the FTAs have been announced or the duties have been brought down, in the medium to long term, these are all factors that are going to favorably impact the industry. But in the near term, there are other compelling pressures. For example, the infrastructure, the time it takes for us to get the containers sailing. Secondly, the labor availability, the labor productivity. But I think while these have been the challenges, but what is the good thing right now is that all these are structurally being addressed through the Government of India initiatives. So therefore, I'm very positive that over the next 2-3 year horizon, as a combination of FTAs, combination of structural initiatives in terms of PLI schemes, textile parks, in terms of skill upgradation, all this is looking good. In the interim, such crude shocks that have happened in terms of geopolitical crisis, I think a rebate is a welcome development. My only submission is that allow this to continue for a much longer horizon instead of an extension of 6 months from time to time, please.
Right, so that's the outlook on the textile sector. Really, the textile sector has been facing a lot of problems, and perhaps government has come out with this notification with respect to extension of the tenure and timeline. Mr. Jain, thank you so much for taking your time out and joining us here on ET Now. But on that note, we need to slip into a very short break. More news and updates will continue on the other side.